Hello, I'm Adam Fleming, and from the BBC World Service, this is The Global Story. 1 year ago, the world watched as Britain crowned a new monarch for the first time in 7 decades. The reign of King Charles III was predicted to be a critical turning point for the royal family, a chance to redefine the role of the monarch for the 21st century. But what a 12 months it's been. The year since Charles's coronation has been marked by illness, family troubles, and political turmoil. Today, we'll look at how the King has navigated each of these challenges, how the British people feel about their monarch, and what does the future hold for the institution of the British monarchy. And with me today are my BBC colleague, presenter and royal reporter Sarah Campbell. Hello, Sarah.
Hello to you.
And also joining us is Robert Hardman, who's a journalist who writes for the Daily Mail. He's a royal biographer whose latest book is called Charles III, New King, New Court, The Inside Story. And you also co-produced a BBC documentary called Charles III.
Hello, Adam. That's right.
Busy man. Robert, you've covered the royals for a very, very long time. I think of whenever there's a big royal event, I just think of you sitting there next to David Dimbleby, who presented them for a long time, or Kirsty Young, who's doing them now. There's literally 1,000 years to draw on when we talk about the royals. But from your time observing them, is there a moment that you think just is the quintessential, that is Charles, that's the moment you sort of can pinpoint that's who he is?
Yeah, I think it was the day after he became king, actually. We were all still kind of in a state of national shock after the death of Elizabeth II. And he suddenly arrived outside the palace and he stopped his car outside the gates, didn't drive in, and just plunged straight into the crowds. And it just changed the tone and the mood on the spot. It was fascinating.
And Sarah, the biggest moment in the royal news cycle in the last few days was the King's return to public duties, and he went to a cancer hospital. What was that event like to cover?
Yeah, well, I think there are parallels actually with the what Robert was talking about, because there was this expectation or concern, and there's been so much concern over the last couple of months about, what the state of the King's health, what is he going to be like. So there was, I don't know, I think there was a sense of what's going to happen, and then a real sense of warmth when he immediately, the Bentley pulled up. There had been, like every royal engagement I've ever covered, there was a big press pack there, all the photographers jostling position. We were in the midst of lots of skyscrapers. There were people sort of leaning out of windows trying to get a glimpse of the King. And he emerged from the Bentley with the Queen and just had this beaming smile, and he just looked really happy to be there. There was an authenticity, wasn't there, because he was speaking to cancer patients, talking about their chemotherapy that they were going through, knowing that he's going through his own cancer therapy at the moment, and sort of giving little details about his treatment, saying he was going off to have some further treatment later in the day.
What's your take on just how active he's been as a monarch while he's been getting his treatment?
He's made every effort behind the scenes to do what he can, but it's only really in the last few weeks or so that the doctors, everything is obviously down to medical advice, is what his doctors say he can do. The first time we saw him in public was at the Easter service on the Sunday, when he came out of the service, and that was the first sort of mini walkabout that he gave. And again, that was another, like the moment at the cancer centre, that was a really positive sign that they're feeling that he's able to do this.
I just noticed them sort of bigging up things that had never been bigged up before. So, for example, we had a budget where Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, the British Finance Minister, would always go to the palace to brief the monarch on the contents of the budget. We knew that was a tradition, but they made damn sure that was filmed this time and put out on social media so you could see him at work.
I think actually just we're more interested in those things because of the nature of the king's health.
It's interesting, though, because the air of crisis around the king's health dissipated very, very quickly.
Well, it was it was actually the day in January where we had the two announcements within an hour and a half of each other that, first of all, Catherine, Princess of Wales, had undergone this major abdominal surgery, and then 2 hours later we had the fact that the king was having to undergo this hospital treatment. So already you're kind of like, gosh, I don't remember it, something like that with two senior members, the most senior members of the royal family. And then 2 weeks later, you have the king's cancer diagnosis. And then, as we know, the following month, his daughter-in-law as well. So it has been an extraordinary difficult time for a family on a personal level, but also for the royal family as an institution.
Robert, with all your years of experience, that moment where it was briefed to journalists that when both Charles and Catherine were in the same hospital at the same time, and he'd like toddle down the corridor in his dressing gown to go and sit at the end of her bed. Is that a sort of unprecedented kind of level of domestic detail for that family?
I think the whole approach to medical details is just new territory.
Sarah, not to make it sound like the Netflix series The Crown, but at some points plot lines converged, didn't they? So, for example, as soon as the king's diagnosis was announced, Harry, his younger son, who's in exile, in air quotes, in California, dashed back. And actually that felt like a new chapter in their relationship. And talking of chapters, like Harry wrote a book last year called Spare, which was basically brutal about his family.
It was brutal about his family. Funny enough, I wouldn't say it was brutal about the king. Certainly very exposing, and gave a level of detail. Even if it wasn't brutal detail, it was still a level of exposure that the Windsors would not like to have.
It was. I think it was the breach of trust that hurt them more than the actual. I mean, it wasn't brutal. It certainly wasn't brutal about the king or about.
Okay, well, Charles. I meant more like brutally honest.
It was. I mean, I think it was quite an affectionate portrait. Talked about sort of dear old dad sort of listening to audio books in the bath and trying to do his best as a sort of single parent. It was affectionate in many places. But going back to him flying over when the king was diagnosed, I think that did mark a sort of a turning point of sorts. I think it was well received. I think what was particularly well received is the fact that Harry came, met his dad, went back to California, and it didn't leak.
Here's an interesting little sidebar, though. So the big news story lately about Harry's wife, Meghan, is her producing these jams, which have got a slightly weird name. And people sort of kind of laugh a little bit about it, although I'm sure she's selling them in droves, so she's got the last laugh. But yeah, when Charles was the Prince of Wales, he sold like a range of biscuits, which people thought were really good. And he wasn't pilloried for selling biscuits.
I suppose the key difference is, the Dutch originals, which are his biscuits, were apart from being sold in locally and in sort of supermarket chains across the country, but the proceeds of that were going to a charitable foundation, and still do, in fact. Whereas, the Duchess's new venture is a purely commercial one.
But Sarah, this is the great thing about covering the British royals, is that 1 minute you're talking about like the health of the king, which is an incredibly serious subject, and then the next minute you are talking about jam and biscuits. That sort of sums up like the sort of the weird institution that this is.
That is the joy of it. And of course, it's whether you talk about the Duke and Duchess of Sussex as being royals or not. Buckingham Palace, they don't comment on them because they're not working members of the royal family. So there is this kind of weird separation that they are royal, but they kind of aren't royal.
People have been talking about Prince Andrew again. So the king's younger brother, who had been friends with Jeffrey Epstein, the convicted sex offender who took his own life when he was in prison. And we've been talking about it again because, sorry, another Netflix advert here. Other streaming services are available because there's a Netflix drama about the big interview that the BBC did with Prince Andrew that basically led to him being stripped of his royal duties. Have we had any hints about how the king is managing the Andrew situation?
Well, I guess one might argue, and Robert, I'm happy for you to take this one. The King's been otherwise engaged, I think, over the last couple of months. So perhaps hasn't been watching Scoop. I'm not sure. We'll see. But it's a difficult issue, I think, isn't it, for Andrew? So the Newsnight interview was back in 2019, and he had his titles stripped. He's not a working member of the royal family. But as you say, he's still around because he is and always will be a member of the royal family. He is the king's younger brother. And so at family events, and I think this is what the public has sort of difficulty coming to terms with why we're seeing Prince Andrew. He's not a working member of the royal family, but you will see him at family events. So the coronation, which was sort of a family event, you've got the Easter service. He was there, because that is a family event. So he will always be in the mix. And the king, I would say it's a very difficult issue to deal with, as I guess it is in families.
He's there. He kind of effectively, he's living in the compound. I mean, he's on the Windsor estate, and anything to do with public roles, public life, that's over for him.
Let's delve into the politics a bit, because Sarah, rewind us back to a few years when he was the Prince of Wales. Actually, we'd got quite used to him getting involved in politics a bit, like not in a major way and not in an overtly political way, but he'd make his views known, wouldn't he?
He was very not backwards in coming forwards about putting forward his two penn'orth, writing letters to ministers, and they've been asked about it, haven't they? And they've said, well, we got them, and we either read them or didn't read them. We appreciated that he knew what he was talking about. And that was as far as it went. And I was looking back, actually, an interview that he gave in 2018, one of the documentaries, and he was specifically asked, when you become monarch, are you going to keep doing this? And his answer was, well, that would be nonsense. Of course, I'm not going to do that. It's a very different role, being the heir to the throne and being the monarch. And I think that has been quite interesting to see that play out.
And in terms of the issues that we knew he cared about, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, architecture, climate and nature, and alternative medicines like homeopathy. I would say those to me. And the arts in general, yeah.
Education. Yeah.
I mean, I remember around about the coronation interviewing Andrew Lloyd Webber, the composer of many great musicals like Phantom of the Opera and Evita, and he's saying, oh yeah, one day I got a call from him because he was very worried that there were not enough people playing the organ anymore, and that was something I was worried about too. So we had a summit about how to make sure people were still playing the organ.
He's actually presented his own BBC documentary years ago on Parry, the great composer, of I Was Glad, the sort of one of the great coronation pieces.
Although I'm thinking of a time when actually he did seem quite overtly political, and it was around the COP climate change conference in Egypt in 2022, where we were all assuming that he was going to go because he cared about climate change. But then Liz Truss, the then Prime Minister, her again, sort of vetoed him going. And then he used his convening power to basically host a sort of almost like rival event at Buckingham Palace a few days before.
I mean, it was very early on it was shortly after the late Queen had died. So it was a real test, actually, of what the relationship with the government's like. And I think people assumed that because of his backstory with climate, that he would absolutely be going to COP in Sharm, and so it was quite a surprise.
It was a very interesting judgment call. Ultimately, it was a case of the king taking the formal advice of his prime minister, and that's his constitutional role. But there was also within his circle, and certainly at the palace, there wasn't a huge objection, because actually, when you become king, where you go first on your very first visit, but like when you're a new US president, huge thought is given, where do you go first? Because it's a real statement. But you're right, at the time, it was a big talking point. The king's not going. We know he's fascinated and loves the environment, and this is a big thing. But then a year later, he did go to COP when it was in the UAE.
Unless we rapidly repair and restore nature's unique economy, based on harmony and balance, which is our ultimate sustainer, our own economy and survivability will be imperiled.
Let's try and get a handle on the king's relationship with his subjects, like the British people.
I think the big split is a generational split. So in terms of the challenges going forward with the king, and obviously the first challenge is the health challenge, once that's been sorted. But if you look at the latest YouGov polls, this was September 23. 30% of 18 to 24-year-olds say the monarch is good for Britain. 30%. So it's not a lot, 30%. 62% overall want to keep the monarchy. So there are issues there. In 2013, 17% wanted an elected head of state. In 2023, it was 26% want an elected head of state. So although the numbers aren't still going one way, it's a challenge for the monarchy, and it's certainly a challenge, I think, for the younger generation. I think that's what's been particularly difficult with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex leaving the family, is that actually, in terms of their ability to appeal to a completely different generation and a diverse generation, is that they're now gone for the monarchy.
It's never going to be the mob storming the palace gates that brings the monarchy down. It's going to be, a lack of relevance. It's going to be people waking up one morning and thinking, well, what's the point of you? So they have to keep relevant, and particularly when at the same time, the monarchy is seen as representing a lot of old things that aren't so good. It's seen as, empire, colonialism. There's a whole debate on, its connections with the British Empire, going further back, allegations of links to slavery. I mean, all this sort of stuff is a challenge. But overall, I mean, the settled view of the large majority of people in this country is that they are content with this system of government. It's totally irrational. Everybody gets that. If you were starting a new country,
start from here.
You wouldn't start a new country anymore. You wouldn't say, right, I'm going to give that family everything, lots of big houses and a crown forever. You wouldn't do it. But it's where we are.
And certainly the Republican movement has been much more active since the death of the Queen, in the sense that now when the King and Queen, when they were out and about, you'd quite often see the yellow flags, belonging to Republic. Of course, there was an egg, I think, thrown at the King.
Yes, there was an egg in York.
One of the very early engagements.
A yoke in York.
And that all just kind of didn't happen. So there's a vocalising. There's an increasingly vocal anti-Republic
Although we did see, you're right, we saw quite a bit of that in the early days after the change of reign. I think hardcore Republicans thought this is our moment. This is where we've got to capitalise on the sort of uncertainty. And you did see these protests wherever the king went, not my king, but they were small, but they were very vocal. They were very well organised. It was their right to be there. No one tried to stop them being there. There was obviously that very questionable incident on Coronation Day when some of them were arrested for merely protesting. I mean, that I think that upset,
including I think someone who'd actually gone because they loved the royal family.
Yeah.
To see
the palace were appalled by. It's like, well, why? On this day of all days, don't start arresting, the handful of Republicans who've turned up. It's just, it was an overreaction by the police. I think they're still looking into it.
Right, let's draw this episode to a close. What are some things you will be watching out for in the next few months to kind of gauge how King Charles is going about his kingship?
Well, primarily it's whether he's getting back onto his summer schedule, whether he appears at the D-Day anniversary commemorations, whether he's at Trooping the Colour, state visits, all of that. I mean, I think everything feels a little bit like the coronation year hasn't really started. It started and then it's been on pause. And so really, hopefully looking forward to getting back. And let's not forget that he is king not just here, but he's head of state in 14 other realms. Would Australia like to have their monarch come and visit them? Yes. Would all of these other realms? So that all of these things that should have been in the planning that have had to be put on pause. So we want to see the pause button taken off.
Robert?
There are some big ticket events, both here in Britain, as you say. His birthday parade, I think that's very important. Trooping the Colour, as it's known. Will he be on a horse or not? I hope he's not. I think he's more than earned the right to ride in a carriage like his mother did in her later years. But also, big events. There's a big Commonwealth Summit coming up in the Pacific in Samoa in October. That's a very big moment because there are sort of all sorts of tensions within the Commonwealth, everything from historic justice to the environment.
Robert, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
And Sarah, thanks to you too.
You're welcome.
And thank you to you for watching. If you would like to hear more episodes of The Global Story, then search for us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can leave comments about this episode down below. Bye for now.